Awesome. Well, thank y'all so much for popping back in here. I appreciate y'all. Last time we linked up, we started the process of diving into React. I'm super excited about that because we're cracking into my favorite bit of programming related frameworks and stuff. So shout outs to y'all for making it this far. Like I said last time, we're really getting into the realm of professional modern JavaScript frameworks. It's still, one semester. It's kind of crazy. But, that's how it is. We're diving head first in and just trying to learn as much as we can. So let's just recap what we've gotten to so far, talk about React for a quick second, talk about how we set up our project, what project we're working on, and all of those good things. So first I'll share just the active project we're working on. It's a project that will allow us to submit our favorite links to a table. Pretty simple. Essentially what we'll do is we're gonna have these form inputs populate this table at the bottom. I know it's not styled the best right now, but we'll get into some of the styling hopefully a little later today. But to back it up a bit, right, as you can see, this is just some HTML that is coming back here. I can show you from the console, right? So just some HTML, we got the head, body. The head has a couple different script tags in there and some style links. And we'll talk a little bit more about where those are coming from, what's happening here. And the body, just a couple divs with a heading, a form, and a table, right? The interesting thing isn't necessarily the HTML, but it's how the HTML got here. That is of pretty important substance for us right now. Because we're used to writing in HTML and CSS and JavaScript to this point, but how this got here is actually by way of React, right? And remember, React is a library for creating web and native user interfaces using JavaScript. So what React does for us that is very important and also super helpful is it makes the process of what we needed to do for creating HTML and elements and modifying those elements and modifying CSS elements using the JavaScript DOM way easier because we can basically program all of the visual elements using JavaScript, program all of the stylistic elements in CSS, and React handles the process of updating the actual HTML document with the JavaScript that we're writing. So we don't have to continuously make these very long JavaScript function calls to essentially change things in the code. We can just create JavaScript files that represent what we want to see as elements on the web page. And essentially, the React library helps convert the JavaScript we're writing for those, what we call components, to the actual HTML that we then would see on an app like this. So the interesting part about this app is that all of this code is being generated via JavaScript and inserted into an HTML document, which is super cool. And unlike a little bit of the other workflow where we needed an HTML document to then run the JavaScript, etc. How we built this particular React app was we leveraged the Node JavaScript runtime, which allows for us to run JavaScript code in our outside of the browser and our terminals and just on our operating system. And coming on top of Node really is the ability for us to execute JavaScript code in different places, right? Typically, we needed to open JavaScript up as an extension of an HTML site, but with Node, you can actually add JavaScript into your whatever the local environment you're working in, and whatever operating system. So Node is a very important aspect to how JavaScript projects are created. One of the valuable things about using Node is it supports a number of different packages and libraries, all built in JavaScript to help make our lives easier. Some of those packages contain just resources and code that we want to pull into our code and then use at different points within our program's execution. But some of the work that we can use Node to do is manage executable functions of JavaScript that we might want to call in order to start projects and set things up. And in that vein, there is a particular set of ways that we launch new React projects by way of what we call using React frameworks. And frameworks are essentially command line tools that we use to launch React applications. What a command line tool would give us is the ability to like run a very simple command that will help start our project for us. It will start the project with the right files, the right structure, in order to basically allow us to write React very easily. One of the particular frameworks that is pretty popular now for getting started with React is Vite. Vite is just a tool chain, what we call React tool chain or command line interface that allows for you to launch a React project with one command. So we use Vite, and the last time we linked up, we used Vite in order to create a React project that's using JavaScript very easily. And as you can see here, there are a couple other template presets you can use in Vite to start projects in different languages. But for I shouldn't say languages, they're all JavaScript, but different JavaScript frameworks, let's say. So we use Vite to create a React application by way of running a command like this: npm create Vite at latest. It went through this little builder in the command line where we were able to say, hey, I want to create a React app. I want to name it this, that, and third. And we were able to get the project files that we want. So how this all comes back to what we're looking at in the app is that we launched this new React application and it gave us some default files that we were able to see, oh, wow, like this is our default React application. But now we started changing things up. And so we got to the point where we have our own code base that we're working off of. And I'll show you a look at that code base so we can get on the same page about what is it that we're even talking about here. So, sorry about that. So we built this, so we used the Vite application in order to create the default files for this project that we call Favelinks, right? Favelinks is a project that was created using that Vite command to initialize all of our files and the right packages for our React application. One of the things, and if you look back at the old video, we kind of walked through the folder structure and what's going on in there. But the most important thing whenever you're looking at React files is take a look first at the package.json, because the package.json gives you some helpful information about, how was this particular JavaScript project created? How is it expected to run? And what other packages do we need to use to make this JavaScript project work? So the package.json is a great point of entry file. It is the point of entry file for all JavaScript projects. But when you're, with different tool chains, different frameworks, it's hard to know, well, what did they use to start this project? The package.json will give you some good insight. So clearly you can see from these scripts, I use Vite. So we're able to actually launch our application using the Vite dev. We're able to launch our actual application using the npm run dev command, which will allow for us to initialize Vite within this project. And the Vite will basically run on itself to launch the server that we are expecting for our application. This is a React application, and clearly there's a couple other dependencies that we're using. Dependencies are just extra bits of code that we bring into our code program in order to accomplish certain things. But outside of the package.json, the most important set of things related to React projects typically falls within a directory called src, or source. In this source directory, you're going to see a number of different files that are important to how the application itself is run, right? And so in this case, we have a main.jsx file where we actually are creating the initial point of entry for React into our HTML document. We have this particular React bit of code is rendering whatever we tell it to render to inside of our HTML document at this point. So there's a little bit of JavaScript going on to make sure that the React can connect properly to our HTML document and then render whatever visual elements we want it to render to the screen that we define in JavaScript. And we can define those visual elements by way of a syntax called JSX, which is a JavaScript syntax that allows for us to essentially use JavaScript to write out the visual elements of what we want to see on our site. And we'll take a look at that in a second. And also to call what we call components, which are bigger groups of objects that contain a number of JSX elements within them. So like I said, we'll dive into the JSX bit in a quick second. But the biggest point that I want to say here is that the app here is an example of a component being rendered. So here we're rendering our first component, which is a component called app. This component called app is actually a file that we're importing from app.jsx, which is its own file. And inside of that file, you can see a bit of code that we wrote in order to get the ball rolling. So we have this functional component. What we call a component is really just a function that returns some data object. And that data object is JSX. So JSX really is JavaScript syntax for the visual elements that we're used to working with in HTML, plus all of the JavaScript functionality and even still the ability for us to also call our custom components that we design as well. So JSX is super important. It's super vital to how we work with React. We use JSX to define the visual elements, but we can organize JSX using components. That's kind of how everything breaks down. Theoretically, we could just write JSX if we don't really need a number of components, but it becomes easier to read your code when you separate things out into components, which is exactly what we did in our last session. We started with a couple of bits of lines of code here, and then eventually segmented things out into their own components. Like this is the form component, really just a form with a couple labels and inputs. And the table component, which is an HTML-like table, but this is JSX, that is returning a table row with the header of the table row predefined, right? So in this capacity, the JSX is going to look and feel a lot like HTML, but it's important to remember that this is JavaScript. So because this is JavaScript, there is a lot more that we're able to do than just kind of define one string of a document. We talked a little bit about imports and exports. Exports allow for me to take any object within a file and export it so that another file can import that particular whatever it is, whatever the object is that we exported, we would want to be able to import it. So here in this example, I wrote the table component, which is everything from here. And as you can see, that table component only returned some value. That was really all it did. It returned a table with a row and a header like this, right? So the table is returning that JSX, but we're calling this table and we're saying, hey, I want to actually see this table in the app.jsx, which is our main application component, like we talked about from the main.jsx. So the flow of this is the main.jsx is the first JavaScript file to run. It's defined within our HTML as a module and it gets called in the body of the HTML document. But that main.javascript file that's being asked to run is clearly running this code here to then render whatever is in the app. And what is inside of the app is a div that's containing the heading, a form, and our table. So just quick pause. Give me a thumbs up if just as a recap, this makes some sense to you. I know that you haven't written React, you haven't written any JSX yet, but just at a high level, if what I'm talking about in terms of what you're seeing in relationship to the elements for the purpose of what we're trying to get done makes sense, that would be helpful to know. Thank y'all so much for those of y'all raising your thumbs. I appreciate it. Um, cool. Cool. If you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat and I'd be happy to address it. And let me just turn off this fan. Cool. So we have right now the ability for us to create these components, right? And remember, components are just essentially small objects of JSX. So in this case of the app component, right? All a component really is doing is providing us the variable that we can refer to that is an object of JSX data. So the app is an object of JSX that contains a div holding an H1, a form, and a table, right? Um, and then similarly, right, the table is, sorry, I got a new keyboard that's tweaking on me. The table is just a assortment of JSX elements that allow for us to see a table, right? So remember, this looks exactly like HTML, but it is written in a JavaScript file and thereby allows for us to um, really kind of work with JavaScript in all of the things that we're doing within the visual elements. And we'll take a better look at that today as we keep hacking on this. So app is really responsible for kind of rendering a div. And the reason we're rendering a lot of divs, or you'll see divs a lot, is in order to render a bunch of elements, you're gonna have to wrap those elements in some parent container component. And in our case, we're just using a div. There's a couple other ones that we can use, like for instance, in the form, right? The form element itself is a container for a number of different elements, or the table element is an example again of an element that contains a container for other elements as well. So just those three, tables, divs, forms, like are good examples of containing elements. So those are all of the components that we're working with right now. The app is essentially kind of creating an H1 and then rendering our form component and our table component. The form component is a form, rendering a form. That form has a label and an input, as well as a break for a new line. And then the second one is here. The second input is here with the for URL and the text in order to hold that information. And essentially, once all that's there, then we're able to input it. And our goal is to make it so that when we input it, we're able to then get it to go and populate the table. So that's kind of a quick recap. The only other thing that's here is, when it does come to styling, even though, like I said, I was holding it to the end, we can add styles to a component very simply by way of one, making sure we leverage class names as a attribute to just kind of refer to a specific element, but also we are able to connect the CSS file to then style those particular elements as well as those attributes. So in this case, we made an app.css file to accompany the app.jsx. Anytime you have a CSS file you want to add to an existing JSX file, you just kind of have to import it like this. And inside of the app.css, you'll see a couple of different things that were here when we first started the application. But I even myself, I was playing around with some of the styling for the table and the table row to just kind of make things look a little bit more clean. So pause, I'll pause real quick and just check for understanding. If that's making sense to you so far, just give me a thumbs up. We're gonna go back diving right back into it and kind of playing around with some of the code. So hopefully it'll refresh your memory on a little bit of what I'm talking about. But if so far so good, definitely give me a shout out so I can see and make sure I count. Cool. Cool. That's actually a good amount of people. Dope. That's what's up. Yeah, you'll get it more when you get your hands on stuff, but till then, till then, right? So let's finish our app. I think we've been talking about it long enough. It's just a good time now to kind of switch gears and finish it up so that we can at least get the data to go from the table to the form and move in a positive direction from there. So if you're ready to rock with me, all you have to do is, if you're gonna follow along, pull up the code, and if you don't have a code, don't worry, just follow along, and you'll be able to get access to the code a little later. But if you are gonna follow along with me, just give me a thumbs up or something so I know who's gonna be coding alongside me today. And yeah, welcome aboard, fam. Hey, I'm happy to hack with y'all. Yeah, okay. We got like 9 folks. Okay, I mess with it. I see y'all. All right, lit. All right, well, here we go, y'all. We finna do this. That's what's up. Cool, 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 cool. Um, Awesome. So once y'all get your code up, then we should be good to go. I'll recap how we get things launched, and you'll be able to hopefully see the same kind of situation that I'm looking at. So if you have already created a project, what you're going to want to do is go find your project in VS Code, or, yeah, wherever it is on your particular machine. You want to find that folder that you've got created and just open it back up in VS Code. When you open it up in VS Code, all you want to do to launch your server, if your server stopped and you're not able to see it, to test it first, to know if you're able to see it, what you're going to want to do is go to a browser tab and just type in, you can ignore this part, just type in localhost colon 5173. This is the default port that the Vite application runs on. Remember, we were using a live server and it launched things at a specific port. Same thing when we use the Vite application server, it will launch at a specific port, which is 5173. So I'll go to localhost colon 5173. If you see something, that means your server is still running. Your local server is still running and you're good to go. But if you don't see anything, or it just kind of loads as if there's nothing there, what you want to do is, again, go back to VS Code, find the code for the project that we had started, and then in the terminal, make sure that you're in the folder for that project, because otherwise this command won't work. Then what you're going to want to do is run the command npm run dev, which will essentially run a script that will call this this line here. So npm run dev essentially says npm, which is a part of Node that allows us to install packages or run particular scripts. We're saying, hey, npm, I want you to run a script called dev, and that's what this dev script is right here. That script isn't doing anything too crazy. All it's really doing right now is running the Vite command, but later you can create scripts of your own and make them as complex as you want. But once you run npm run dev, like I said, it's going to launch a development server for you, and then it's going to tell you, hey, go to localhost colon 5173 to see your site. And again, this is a site that's local to you, so you won't be able to actually share that with somebody else to let them see. But we'll get to that stage where we can do that a little later. All right, cool. So if you got your project up, you're ready to follow along, just give me a quick thumbs up. And without further ado, good people, we're gonna get into the content that we got planned for today. Appreciate y'all. Thank you. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. I see y'all. You know what I'm saying? I see y'all. I see y'all. Y'all think I don't see y'all, but I see y'all. All right, cool. So again, as I'm going, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. But let's try to finish this up. So far we have the form and we have the table, but as you might can tell, if I go ahead and just say something like, GitHub, and then in the GitHub, I just want to add github.com/community, right? Submitting the form right now is triggering a reload and nothing's happening with our table. If you remember the last project we worked on that was very similar to this, there's a couple of big things that we have to do in order to make it so that we can take the data from this form's input and populate it into the table, right? So that's exactly what we're going to work on today. In doing that, we're going to introduce some more React core concepts. So right now, at this point, if you're following along me to this point, you should be fairly understanding of the concept of JSX, which is the actual visual elements that we write in JavaScript in order to show things from our files, right? JSX can take the form of just the individual base level element or custom components that are bigger objects that we can define that have JSX inside of them. But all functions, all components in React are going to return some amount of JSX for us to render on the screen. And that's exactly how React works. We take the JSX in JavaScript, we render it into HTML on the other side. So I say that to say the form and the table, we have them as components and we have JSX inside of them. The next most important couple of things that we're going to have to talk about to make this application work are things like event handlers. How do we process whenever a user actually is submitting something into our app, right? So we're going to have to take a look at event handlers and event listeners. And then we're going to need to figure out, just like we had to in the last project, how do we actually take the data from this particular event that's going to happen when we submit the data here and then turn that into something that we can send to the table, right? Those are our kind of some of the big things that are outstanding for us right now. So here's where we'll start. First thing I'm going to start with is the actual form to just kind of make it so that instead of it like reloading every time I type a couple things and press submit, I want to make it stop so we can at least see what we submitted. So let's start with just kind of checking and verifying that we're actually seeing something here. And then from there, we'll be able to make some better choices on what we can do with that data over time. So I'm going to start in the form, and this will be a great place for us to start talking a little bit more about these event listeners, right? So remember, within HTML, there were a number of different event listeners that we could create. We could create an event listener for when something is clicked. We can create one when the page loads, all of those things. And the reality is we can still do that in React. It's just done a slightly different way. So in the case of JSX and working with React elements like this, adding event listeners is actually super simple because it kind of looks like how it kind of works like it worked with HTML, but we get the best of both worlds where we can just directly add the JavaScript inline as well. So what I mean by that is, if you remember, in HTML, if we were adding event listeners, we can add them into the elements as kind of like a little attribute, right? But then when we started actually writing JavaScript, we had to do all this stuff like document, get element, add event listener, which became very, very tedious to do from JavaScript. So adding event listeners in the adding event listeners in JavaScript React context is way more simple. Sorry, y'all, fasting brain, right? I'm like, trying to push through. Inshallah, inshallah. So boom. So we got this form, and we want to know when something's been submitted to the form, right? And remember, there's an event that we can use to check when things are being submitted. It's called on submit, right? There's an event for when something is submitted. So on submit. So here we can actually call, can actually just by typing on inside of the JSX element, you can see a bunch of the different events that we could listen for, right? So on clicks, on copies, cuts, drags, drops, everything you want, we got, right? Um, but for us, what we really care about with relationship to this form is it's coming, wait for it, wait, ooh, there's a lot of peace, is, oh my God, this is, oh, there it is, submit, right? So the on submit attribute is what will allow for us to do something when we hear this event, right? And remember, in HTML, it was all simple like this. It was like, oh, if you want a form, write an on submit method and then pass some JavaScript into it. Well, good news is with JSX, it's just as simple. So here, though, we don't pass just a string to JavaScript like we would have done in HTML. Here, and just to confirm this, because now my brain is going, I'm talking, and I'm like, y'all might not remember what I'm talking about because it's been a minute since we've done some HTML. So let me just quickly show you this. So let's say I didn't know anything about HTML forms, and I'm like, oh, cool, like I want to learn a little bit about HTML forms because I want a form on my website, and it's like, oh, I'll add a form, right? So if we go and take a look at the HTML forms in the W3 schools, we'll see these nice looking forms. We're like, oh, boom, I want to do something like this in my code, but I'm working in React. Well, if you think about it, all of this HTML really correlates very well to what our experience is with relationship to the JSX, right? Matter of fact, I could probably pull it up on the side here and show you that it's like kind of one-to-one in that capacity, right? So we have the form, whoops, we have the form, we have a form, right? Label input, label input, label input, label input. Even got the break tags, right? There is like a one-to-one correlation between what we have to do in HTML with what we have to do in JSX. Give me a thumbs up if you see what I'm talking about, because this, my friends, is an important point in the class, right? So everything you would want to do in JSX and JavaScript translates exactly to what you would have done in HTML in the sense of the elements that you need, right? The things that become different are in the attributes and how the attributes are named and what we got to do for them. So in this case, we're going to see that like while the elements are the same, some of the attributes are also the same, but some of them will change, right? So this actual example doesn't use the same event that we were listening for. So let's see if there's one that actually will use on submit instead of a no, they don't. But if we go, let's do this. I'll show you what I was talking about here. So let's go to the HTML events so you can see, right? Remember, on a form, there's a number of different events that we can call. We just saw a bunch of them. But as you can see, all of these attributes sound literally the same as the ones we were just peering through over here. So if I go, oops, if I go over here and I say form on, right? On a board, on blah, 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 right? On blur is in here, on change is in here, right? On context menu, right? Is in here, right? Hopefully you can see without me having to go through all of them. They're all here. But again, there's a mapping between what were events in HTML and what events we can actually call within the JSX and JavaScript. So another good news is that if you look up the reference of these things in HTML, you'll be able to find an equivalent one in JSX. But note the difference, right? Let's look at the on submit down here on the HTML side, and then the on submit over here on our side in JavaScript, right? Fairly similar, but one thing you'll notice is on the JavaScript side, it's on lowercase o n, and then the submit is capitals S. Whereas here in the HTML, it's lowercase s, right? So that's what I mean when I say some of the attributes will be slightly syntactically different in JavaScript than it is in HTML. If we look though at how the onSubmit is called, right? This looks pretty identical to how it's going to look when we're working with it in JavaScript, right? So here we have the form, and this is just an example of a form, but on submit, on clicks, whatever the event is you're adding to an element, it's the same process, just figuring out what is the actual event you want to call. In our case, we might want to use the on submit method to check when the form is submitted. So as you can see, we can say, oh, form, hey, there's an on submit method and I'm going to pass it some JavaScript in a string. That's how we did it in HTML, right? That's how we added an event listener to HTML. Same thing in JSX. Hey, form, I'm going to pass you some JavaScript with this on submit method. But the difference is, whereas in this HTML example, right, remember, in order for this to work, in order for me to call this on submit with this my function like this, I had to have a script tag that has some JavaScript defined. I had to define the function and all of those things just for this to work this way. And these were happening, this is HTML and this is JavaScript. Sometimes this is happening in one file like this. Sometimes this JavaScript is in its own file, and then we got to call it and have two files and all these things and that in the third, and things just start to get a little bit more complex. Whereas with the React and the JSX, this is what I'm talking about, is the value of using JSX and React. I don't need to have a separate HTML file and a separate JavaScript tag or JavaScript file. Everything can be done inside of the component itself, inside of the bit of JSX that I'm returning. It just makes my job a lot simpler because everything from the JavaScript to the HTML to the attribute is all in one place using JSX. Give me a thumbs up if you see what I'm talking about, because again, I'm trying my best to impart you with knowledge, fam. It's tough. Hopefully it's making some sense. You know what I'm saying? Like, hopefully I'm reaching y'all, you know what I'm saying? Like, just really try it. Like, half a brain and stuff, haven't eaten and drinking water all day, you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to pass y'all knowledge right quick. But yeah, this, hopefully you see this makes it simple. And if this doesn't drive the point home, let's just revisit real quick how we would have to do this if we were just using JavaScript. Like let's say we didn't use the HTML way of adding the event listener and we went back to the JavaScript specific way, right? And we went and said, hey, you know, in the HTML DOM, we want to handle some DOM events, right, and react to stuff. Well, remember that when we're adding events in the events in JavaScript, we had to do all types of stuff just to hear the event, right? Remember, like for JavaScript functions to pass JavaScript and add JavaScript to existing elements, we had to find the element and then add an event listener, and then with the event listener, define the function and then add the function, right? Give me a thumbs up, y'all remember this now, right? Now, instead of having to do all of these things to like work with the JavaScript to add to your HTML, it's as simple as everything is in one place. You don't need to have these separated JavaScript functions connecting to elements in your document, right? It all can happen within the JSX. That's one of the things that makes the JSX so powerful and why a lot of developers are using React over these older traditional ways of writing JavaScript. All right, I'm done preaching, and let's just get to some code. Done preaching, let's just get to code. So now you understand that we can actually just write the event listeners straight into the JSX, which just makes our job a lot simpler for us and gives us the ability to make these programmatic decisions. I see a question in the chat about, does this only work with .jsx files? The answer is no. This works with any JavaScript project that is using React. So in different React different React frameworks that we start projects with, they make the decision whether they're going to use .jsx files or .js files both can do it. In fact, you can't actually use .jsx files unless you brought in a couple libraries for React and the React DOM and Babel and stuff like that, which allow for us to process .jsx files. But by default, we can do this within a JavaScript file. So you can do it in a .js file or a .jsx file, so long as your app in the JavaScript in the node environment knows that you're using React. Hopefully that makes sense. Great question. Yep, no problem. So let's get this submit working so y'all can see what I'm talking about, right? So just one last recap here. Remember, when we're doing events, whether it's the way of adding it via JavaScript or using like the HTML versions of like creating events, we're passing functions into whatever the event is, right? So in this case, the event is on submit. Here's the function I want to call. In this case, hey, we're saying, hey, whenever the button, we hear a click, we're going to call display date, and that's this function here, right? So we're always passing functions into whatever it is that we're whatever elements are responding to events. So in our case, what we want to do is the same thing. In this on submit, I want to call a function so that I can do something whenever we hear that something's been submitted. Now remember, there are two ways that we can define functions in JavaScript. One way is the default, is the old school function keywords scenario, where, for instance, I could say, hey, let me just define a new function, function handle. Sorry, y'all. I got this new keyboard and it is the bane of my existence. Handle submit. And inside of this handle submit function, right, I could I could do something like alert and say submitted, right? And then here in this on submit, I can pass handle submit as a parameter for it. The curly braces you're gonna get used to seeing curly braces a lot in JSX. The best way to think about it is anything inside of curly braces within the JSX is allowing you to pass some JavaScript in as data. So the JavaScript could be a variable or an object, like a function call that you want it to call. It could be a string, it could be a conditional, it could be whatever is going to return some JavaScript piece of data, right? In this case, we have the handle submit method. I'm just calling the handle submit like so. And so now, right, if I actually save this, I have the handle submit, on form submit, handle submit, alert submitted. So let's just go ahead and take a look at this and then see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and press submit. And boom, we get this alert that says that the form has been submitted, right? Still get this refresh and stuff like that, but we can actually change that very simply by way of using some of the logic of how event and event handling works in JavaScript. So remember, whenever you call an event, so whether it's on click, on submit, on drag, on drop, on whatever, whatever function you pass into that event listener, that function is going to receive some data whenever the event takes place. That we typically will pass that data gets passed into the function as an argument. You have the opportunity to name that argument whatever you want, but typically whenever you have an event and an event handling function, whatever the function is, we typically note that we're going to receive the event as data. So I call it event. Sometimes you see people call it E to be a shorthand for event. I like to make my code readable, so I call it event. But after we've alerted that it's been submitted, matter of fact, we can do it beforehand just to set the pace here. When this function first gets called, we're going to call event prevent default, which is just going to stop the page from reloading in that way that it does whenever the form gets submitted. By doing that, it's going to help us just kind of really take a look at things as they are before the page reloads. So now I'm going to save that, go back to the browser, submitted. and boom, we don't refresh, but we gotta have the experience that we want with relationship to the code. And I can go back to the main URL to just show that one more time. Oh, cool. So we actually got our first event in here, right? And we use this function, define the function. That function is calling these bits of code, and it's happening whenever the form is being submitted. Now, remember I told you like there's a couple of different ways we can write this function, right? The function keyword is one way, but I would say this is an older school approach to doing it. So if I were to do this in a newer school approach, I would use what we call arrow functions. And arrow functions allow us to essentially define functions as objects in an easier way. So I could say something like let handle submit, which is going to be the name of my new function, my arrow function. I'm going to set it equal, just like I would any variable, right? Like if this was array, I would set it like this, right? If this was a string, I would set it like this, right? But in this case, it's a function. And arrow functions allow us to define this like so. So to define a function as an object like this, we just give it the parentheses that we would a regular function, pass an arrow like so, and then in the curly braces is where we define what happens in the function. So in this case, I still would want this function to receive an event, and I want that event to prevent default, and I still want to do my little alert with the submitted from arrow function, right? So because this function has the same name, this still is fine, but now you see two different ways of writing functions. Going forward, I'm probably going to just keep writing my functions as arrow functions, but just remember that an arrow function is basically the same as writing these older school functions. It's just different syntax and a more modern approach to writing and declaring functions. So let's just do a quick test, make sure that that doesn't break anything. Cool, submitted from the arrow function, great, perfect, everything's working as we would want. But Bet, we can't just stop there, right? We can't just stop there because of the fact that, hey, while this is great, I want to now get data on like what is the value of this input when this is being submitted. And if there's no input data, I want to tell the user, hey, so you got to add something, right? So how can I do this, right? Well, we know how we can do this in JavaScript. It's as simple as, quote unquote, simple as find the element in the document, look at that element's value, and then do all this stuff, right? We have to look and find this element in the document. But the reality is React doesn't want us to have to keep looking up elements in the document, right? Especially because technically this isn't HTML, this is JSX. So this doesn't really exist fully in the document for us to say, basically this is JSX. So it's not the same as HTML. So there's a couple different nuances to it. It does exist finally when it gets rendered, but how can we get that data while we're building out our component inside of itself, right? Those things are where we have to actually leverage a couple of different libraries and functions that come in React to allow for us to better process changes of data within a component, right? So we're in this form component, and this component is going to have some data changing, right? The input is going to be changing as users are typing into it. So we want to make sure that we can keep track of any data that is changing within this component. To do that, we have to leverage a built-in function in React that allows for us to keep track of changes to the state of our different JSX elements. And that is part of the React library, is it's what we call a hook. And a hook is essentially a bit of JavaScript code that allows for us to, in React, set and call specific types of values. So we're gonna make use of a particular hook in React. So we're gonna say import whoops, import use state from React. So basically what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to use our first function from the React library to help us with our code. So the use state is a particular built-in function in React that allows for us to keep track of the state of things within our elements. So I'll show you an example and then we'll use it to kind of keep track of the data at this point so we can make use of it in our code here. So the way that the use state hook works is inside of a component. You have to have it inside of a component. So I can only use it within a component that's declared. So in this case, the only component I have is this form. Remember, we know we know something is a component with the capital letters and whatnot. That's like a kind of big thing. But the syntax for creating a state, a piece of state, and I'll explain what a piece of state is, or hopefully you'll see it in a second. Basically, the syntax is like so. We typically keep state constant, and let me write it, and then we'll talk through what it is. So let's say first, I want to keep track of the data inside of my input for the name. That way that as that data is changing, I can reference it inside of my component here. So to do that, I'm going to need to create a piece of state that is going to represent the name as data, right? This is just a piece of data. Now, whenever that piece of data is being updated, I want to call a function called setName. This is just something I'm coming up with, right? But it's also part of the syntax that is typical when we're using state in React. Typically, we have the data, and then we have the function that is going to call that data, update that data. And then we set it equal to use state, which is itself a function that takes in what is the default value of this going to be. And in our case, we're going to set it to be equal to an empty string, because when the input for a link name starts, it's empty. So we wanted to know, hey, it's going to start empty, but over time, we're going to keep track of that data and use it to, we're going to keep track of that data and then update this this name, right? So state is essentially a way for us to keep data that is going to change by way of something happening in our component. The reason we want to use state, right? I'm not saying that we couldn't just go ahead and pull the data from the document and whatever. We couldn't have done that. But the thing is, if we really want to update our component and what's going to show up in our component, we need to keep track of that data using state in order to tell our component to update itself. That becomes very important over time when we're building out a bit more sophisticated transfers of data within React. So in this case, I created a piece of state for a name, and we're going to use it now, right? So basically, what I want to have happen is, if we go back to our code, whenever someone starts typing anything into this input, right? Whenever somebody's typing anything into this input, I want to keep track of whatever they're typing and save it as data that then I can then be able to, again, the goal of this is to save this data so I can eventually send it over to this table, right? So in this case, I want to be able to keep track of whatever the name input is saying and whatever the URL input is saying. So to do that, we're going to use state, and we're going to pass into our input an event handler to help us with this. So one of the events that's helpful for the inputs is the onChange event, which basically fires whenever the input itself is changed. So just like we did before, we're going to create an event handling function to handle whenever that input is being changed. So I can say, let handle name change, right? Again, this is going to be a function that's going to get an event, and we're going to inside of here, The only time you really need to do event prevent default is when you are submitting a form. So we don't have to worry about that here. But what we might want to do is we might want to console. Let's do oh my gosh, this keyboard, I'm gonna throw it out the window. Console log um, event dot target dot value, which will help us see, right? Remember, event dot target will tell us which element is triggering this event. But because this is an input, we might want to check out the value of that input at that time. So now by passing handle name change into this input, we'll be able to at least take a look at what is the value of the input as things are being changed, ideally, inshallah. So we're gonna inspect these elements, right? And inside link name, we'll go to the console first. Let's not worry too much about this. We'll change this in a second. As you can see though, in the bottom, we have we're logging all of the changes to them. So clearly we're saving it, right? Clearly we're processing it correctly by way of event.target.value, right? So that's great. But now I want to save it as some data that I can then reference it later, right? Like it's good here now, but I want to reference this piece of data later when I submit it. That's the key. The key is not that I wasn't able to see the data as it was changing. I could have just made this event handling thing. The key is when this is submitted, right? How am I going to actually check what the value of the input is without having to go find the value of the input again? The key to this is if I save the data of that input as state, well, now any part of this component can reference the state and say, hey, well, what is the value of name? Oh, cool, it's this, right? So here, the input is fine. I could have just made the on change and console logged it or whatever, but how will I know what the final value of it is in the submission? Well, the best way for me to do that is to leverage state to keep track of it because it'll allow me to do a lot more within the React context. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So now, whenever the user submits, right, I want to call whatever is, I want to save this data in name and I want to be able to see it when the user presses submit. So to do that, instead of just console logging the name change, I'm going to actually set name. So remember, set name is a function that we're able to call to change and update the value of whatever's held in the name. So for us, what's held in the name right now is an empty string, but we're going to set the name to be whatever is an event target value. So as the input is changing, so is the state value, right? And as that state value changes, that means that whenever somebody references the name, they should get the latest version of whatever the state is. So that's going to allow us, ideally, to then, when we handle submit, we should be able to then do something like, let's just console.log the name, right? Remember, name is here, set name is down here. So whenever the name change event is being called, we're setting the value, but we're going to be able to reference that value using the name. It's a kind of funky syntax when you use hooks. Instead of me trying to articulate it to you as like, oh, well, this looks like an array, it technically is an array, but what we're doing is the use state hook passes back this array, and the array contains the logical answer to what is the name right now. And hey, when I call set name, I want use state to do something to set the name. So it's a complex thing under the hood, but for now, just trust me, you want to use this syntax, and the syntax will allow you to define the value of the state that you want to use, and define the function you're going to call to update that value, and whatever the default value is. And we'll see another example over time, so you'll see it again. But in this case, right, whenever the input for name change is being changed, we're updating the state with that set name function. And then whenever we handle submit, we should be able to console log to see what the value of that name is at that point. So I'm gonna just save this, and we're going to go back to our drawing here, Cam's GitHub. So let's say Google, and then yes, google.com, right? And when I submit it from arrow function, I can clear that. But okay, it's kind of hard to see because we got these console logs. Let's get rid of the console logs so we don't actually see that getting in the way. And then let's do this again. So I'm just say Google, and I'm gonna submit from the arrow function, and boom, Google, cool. So we clearly are, we're clearly seeing that when we submit, right, we're getting back whatever was in the name, right? And that's exactly what we want to have happen. But we're able to do that because we save that value as a piece of state. Think of it like whenever I have a piece of data in my component that I want to change, and I want other parts of the component to respond to those changes, it's best that I save the data that is going to cause those changes as state. So we can do the same thing for our URL, right? So I'm going to create a piece of state for the URL, and I'll say set URL, and we're going to set it equal to use state again. And again, because this is a string that's starting out empty, we're going to default it to an empty string. But now, right, same thing. For this input, I want to create another event handler to say, hey, when this input is being changed, right, I want to call another function for now, let handle a URL change. That's going to get an event handling function. And that function is just going to set the URL to be event.target.value. Whoa, keyboard. Right. And because this handle URL change is only going to be called in this on this input, right? We know this input is responsible for changing the URL, and boom. There's some slicker ways to like consolidate these into one call and just check something like the name as a conditional, but we don't need to do that for right now. We might sauce that up a little later. But now handle URL change is defined. So now I'm setting the URL. So that means when I handle submit, let me check out what's also in the URL, right? Because even if it's empty, it should still at least console log that it's empty, right? So I'm going to save this and go ahead and go back to my app. I'm going to type Google and HTTPS google.com. And boom, now we're getting both the name and the URL, which is dope. And if these were left blank, and we submit it, right, we kind of just get this empty string, right? So cool. So with the state, I'm actually being able to keep track of that data in a completely different function, which is super helpful. If you remember, this is kind of like what we were doing with like tic-tac-toe, or with like the old table form thing, where we were saving the data into an array, and that array was then rendering whatever it needed to render, right? We're saving it in state, and then the component is able to then process this data and use this data later, right? Think of this as like we're holding this data somewhere that then the rest of the component can get to. Cool. Wait, give me 1 second. No, I'm so sorry. So boom. So we, now that we're setting the name, setting the URL, we have both of them being monitored in the submit. We also can do other unique things using this data as well. Like for instance, I could say, I could do something like, hey, if, like, let's say we try to handle submit, but both the name and the URL are empty, right? I could say something like if, like I could do conditions off of the data. I could say if name is equal to the empty string, or and this keyboard is really throwing me off. Or if the URL is equal to the empty string, right? Then I might want to alert, something different. I might want to alert, you know, name and URL are required, right? Else, right? Then I could go ahead and console log. Then I could go ahead and console log the stuff I want to see here. Oops. Like this. And then let me just get rid of this other alert function, or I can just comment it out for now. Right, so hey, when we handle submit, if the name is empty or URL is empty, hey, let the user know that they're required. Otherwise, just console log like we've been doing, right? So now save this, go ahead, submit. Hey, name and URL required. Boom, cool. If they're required, and I go ahead and say Twitter, HTTPS, I guess it's not called Twitter anymore. But boom, that's working, well, which is great. So we got to the point where we actually are able to keep track of the data. We're at a point now where instead of just console logging this, maybe, right, maybe here I want to send this to the table, question mark, right? How can I do that? And that's where we're gonna go next. So basically, as a recap, we're able to use events in the JavaScript JSX very simply, right? We could just add them right into the elements. It makes it so simple. We can just add the event we want. We can add the event handling function into that event. We can process the events and do whatever we want inside of the function. But we just introduced a very important core concept of React, which is called state. State is how a component keeps track of data inside of itself that's changing that will be relevant to how the component performs or shows content. Because another thing we could do with the state is, let's say now that we're tracking whether or not name and URL are empty. Remember, name and URL will be set to the empty string by default when we first launch this state. It won't be until a user handles the name change, or until a user changes the name input or changes the URL input, that those things get set to anything else. So another cool thing that is awesome about how state works with React is we can use state to do some really cool things when it comes to conditionally rendering what's happening on our app at different points. So let's say, for instance, instead of having this alert that, hey, name and URL required, what if I kind of just like make it so that this button, right, this submit button, you can't actually click it until name and URL are not empty, right? Well, how can I go about that? Well, one way to go about that is to pass in a attribute called disabled, right? Disabled is given a value that is a Boolean, right? If you set something disabled to true, right? What that's going to do is it's going to make that particular element unable to be disabled. So like this is a very helpful thing for buttons, but I don't want it to be disabled the whole time. I only want it to be disabled when these fields are empty, right? When they're typed in, I want you to be able to submit. So here's a cool way that you can use state to make this possible. So you see here how this is returning a Boolean. And like I told you, in the curly braces, we can pass any JavaScript kind of expression. So here's a good example of some inline JavaScript using the JSX. So instead of just passing true like this, I could say, I could pass a conditional expression. So I could say name equals empty and URL equals empty. So this is a Boolean condition. If the name is empty and the URL is empty, then technically this will be, if name is empty and URL is empty is true, then disabled will be true, right? If name is not empty and the URL is not empty, then this should be false, right? So this should work in terms of the logic, hopefully. Hopefully I got my logic right. Right. So as we can see, we can submit here. And then if I get rid of the link URL, right, technically I can still submit because I have Twitter in here. But once I get rid of this, now we can see that it is not disabled. So maybe I want to switch this from and to an or, and then maybe that'll do the trick. So Twitter, cool. It still won't let me submit to them. Twitter.com. Cool. So that gets me right where I wanted. So that, like y'all see that, right? Give me a thumbs up if you see how that worked. We just added this super cool conditional logic to make it so our button turns off if this is empty, right? Or if one of them is empty, but turns on as soon as the user has some data in there, right? That's super dope. And that's possible because React allows us to use things like the state to make this change, right? So remember, name and URL aren't static variables. These variables are going to be changed whenever the inputs get manipulated. But because we set this as a piece of state, we're able to use name and URL from the very beginning to say, hey, when the input is first created, we're going to tell it, hey, disable yourself if you see this condition, right? These are some of the cool features that happen with React, JavaScript, JSX, and conditionals and all of these things. So where do we go from here, right? Well, now that we have the form, it seems pretty ready, right, to send this data to the table. We know we can just send these state values over. What do we got to do to make this work for the table's perspective? Well, we haven't really talked about the table at all, so let's cut back over to the tables code. And we can see that the table is just returning a couple elements right now. It's not really doing anything. It's not really doing anything special at this point. But what we might want to do is populate the rest of the table underneath the head, like the rest of the rows, with data coming from the form, right? So to do that, I would want to be able to do that. I would want to be able to like essentially have the table show data based on the I would want to have the table show data based on whatever the form is passing into, right? So to do that, we need the table to receive data from our form. Now, to do this, we have to use another property in React, another kind of key component or key core aspect of working with React called props. So while state allows us to keep track of data inside a component, props allows us to pass data from one component to another, right? State is for data inside a component that's changing. Props, data between components. So that's where we're going to go next, right? Is we're going to have to figure out how can we pass the data from the form to the table logically, but also we want to make sure that our table is prepared for that. So like that our table is able to say, okay, based on whatever data I get, I'll show some different rows of information. So let's talk a little bit about that first, and then we'll get into how we'll actually show the pass the data into the table. So remember, tables are interesting because they just kind of are rows of data, right? There's a couple other elements that we haven't talked about that can help you separate out the rows of elements of data. I'll add some in here right now. So instead of just using the table row, it is kind of common that well, we'll use the table row with the header, but sometimes what is helpful to get some more syntactic clarity here is to wrap the head in what's called a table head element. So I'm just gonna do that real quick to one, get rid of some of those warnings that I was getting before, and just introduce you to a couple other elements. So cool. Sorry, it looks all crazy. So the table head, this is just the same way. It's just kind of a container for the rows, for the row for the head. The next thing though is there is a table body or T body element that is a great holding element for all of the stuff related to our table, right? So here, if I wanted to define some rows, right, I could define a row that has a name, cam test, and oops. So the body will contain different rows, but the rows will contain different pieces of data. So table data, whoops, oh my God, this keyboard, man. The keys are just so spaced apart. It's like my hand's not used to it. You know, it's just like, this is not it. It's like a wireless keyboard. That's why it's like not my normal setup. So basically, right, table rows contain data, and the data will be like something like this, right? Each row would have a piece of data, right? One would be for the name, and then the other would be for the URL. So like test.com, right? Then we just got to close this row, and we're good, right? So if I were to save this, we're gonna see that we added actually a row to our table, right? Now, this is cool because we can keep adding these rows, right? And say, all right, boom, like let's say I want 3 rows, right? Well, that, like in this regard, I'll be able to have this happen. But when it comes to lists in JavaScript, right, it's not good practice to see yourself copying and pasting a very similar structure over and over again. Whenever you see yourself doing this, it's a good chance that you could probably simplify your work using arrays. So that's exactly what we're going to do. And I'm going to introduce y'all to how we do that. So in this case, right, you see kind of the end result of this is the body, the table body should be full of rows of data. Give me a thumbs up if you see what I'm saying, right? Like just like I copied this row of data 5 times, what if I want 100 rows of data, right? I would want this to copy itself over and over again to get to that point. To do this, right, effectively, instead of copying 100 rows, what if there was a way for me to like pass a list of all of the rows that I want into this as data? It turns out that we can do just that with arrays in JavaScript. So let's say I have a piece of data called rows that is, let's say I have a piece of data called rows that is an array. And the array is of different objects that contain a name, and the name is like the name of the link, Cam's test, and maybe like the URL, right? So test.com, right? Or, you know, and I can have multiple ones like name test2, URL, URL, test2. Whoa. So remember, well, I guess this is the URL, right? Test2.com, right? So remember, this is an array, but inside of these arrays, I'm using JavaScript objects. And remember, JavaScript objects are these like key value pairs, colon for the key value, comma for separating the different values, right? Hypothetically, let's say I have this array of rows and it's upwards to 100,000 things, whatever it is. Instead of copying all 100,000 things, well, the cool thing about React is I'm able to pass data using arrays. But the thing is, I don't want to just pass this data, right? If I were to pass this data, the way that I can pass it is like with JavaScript. The way to pass it with JavaScript would be to inside of a curly brace, pass the data, right? Like I could do something like this and say rows. But the thing is that rows right now is not formatted as JSX. It's kind of just an array of data, right? So if I save this and go back, you're gonna see, well, I'm getting some issues here. It's not actually able to format this as a React element. So the key here is while I am able to actually pass data into my JSX, I need that data to be in the format of JSX. So how can I use this fact that I have this data of rows, row data, right, and turn it into JSX? Well, I can leverage this array and make it so that this data becomes JSX by using like a map function. So instead of having an array of just objects, I can map, right? And the map function will allow me to pass in another function that will allow me to say, hey, for every row that I'm looking at for every, let's just say every piece of data within this array, what do I want to do to that? What do I want to do to that data, right? Well, I want to return, right? I want to return essentially a piece of JSX. So here we're getting into some other really interesting stuff, right? So here I can return JSX as a value for the function. So I'm going to return a table row where the table data is going to be called data dot name, right? And again, table data, data.url, right? Remember, data is just going to refer to every element within this array as it's being mapped. What we're returning is a JSX element for each piece of data that takes the data's name, right? This name property and the URL property, and turns and passes them into this JSX as a piece of data. Remember what I said about how we can pass data, JavaScript data, using these curly braces? So here we're saying, hey, there's a table data element, but the data inside of that element is going to be this JavaScript, right? So we're basically passing this JavaScript in and creating an array full of table rows. By doing this, fam, right? Remember now, if I actually have my table body just say, hey, use the rows, right? Well, now I'm actually going to be able to create that table dynamically based on the array, right? So instead of having to pass all of these rows in myself into the table body, I could just pass the JavaScript in that basically is an array of the data of the JSX, and that will work fine. So using arrays and mapping array data into like this is an example for tables, but you can do this for all types of elements in your JSX, right? The point is that the JSX will validly take an array of JSX in as data, which is super, super helpful. So now the question is, well, instead of having this super kind of hard-coded array, how can I replace what this array is with the data that's coming from the form, right? Now, this is the missing piece to figuring this all out, right, for our application. The answer to that is we have to use what I was calling before props. We need to pass the data from the form to the table. Now, the only way in React, the only way for us to pass data from one component to another component is essentially when a component is being rendered. And that means that another component that is rendering it is calling it. when that component is being rendered, that's when we can declare what we call props. But where is the table and the form being rendered? Well, remember, this is just a declaration of this component. This doesn't have anything to do with is this component showing up somewhere, right? It only becomes showing up somewhere when it's being rendered on a component that is already being rendered on the screen. So the only component being rendered right now is our app. But our app, if y'all remember, is returning the form and the table. So this is where those elements are being rendered, right? Rendering an element, a component, is the same as calling the component like this, right? Wherever you're calling a component like this is where you're rendering that component. And hopefully, if that component is being rendered within a component that's already being shown, that's when that component shows up on the screen. So for us, if I want to pass data into a component, the opportunity is endless whenever I'm rendering a component, right? I can pass any piece of data into a component by using what I call props. Props essentially feel like attributes, but you can define the attribute yourself, right? So in this case, I can tell this table, hey, you're gonna get some data called links, right? And links is going to be an array, and that array is going to contain some data, right? I don't know why this is tweaking up. Oh, I gotta probably wrap this like this. Right? So I can say, hey, you're gonna receive some data in the format of links. Remember, I have to wrap any JavaScript kind of data in a curly brace. So to make this work, right, I need the form to be able to send me the data that it needs and store it in an array that then I can pass into the table. Now, friends, I know this might be seeming a little confusing because this is a pretty interesting example of a React application. But let's finish it up so you can actually see these core components, and we'll talk a little bit more about it next time we sync since we're running out of time here. Well, we're almost basically there, right? I already have it so that my form is ready to go. My form has the data, it's keeping track of the data. I just need to send this to the table somehow. Well, the only way for me to send this to the table is to pass it in so that the table can then use this array as a piece of data. So instead of having this hard-coded array, I can give it a value. The only place I can do that is when the table is being rendered like this. So what is the final steps that we got to do? Well, first thing is props are passed by the parent down to the child. So the parent component is the app. So the app is the one that's responsible for passing any data to the table. So in order to actually have this work, I need the app to have data from the form that is going to say, hey, here's the last update on the form. So whenever the form updates, I need the app to update with the data from the form, right? So that I can then pass it into the table. Those are the kind of the big things that need to happen here. So first, to do this, I'm going to create a function that's going to say handle, maybe like on new submission, right? And this is just going to be, this is going to be a function. So I'm just going to name this, give this a function, let on new submission. And basically, I'm going to create a function that I'm going to pass as a callback function for, or maybe instead of I'm just going to call it handle new submission, right? So whenever there's a new submission from the form, I want the form to pass to me the new, let's call it data, the new form data, the new data here, right? And the thing is that the form is going to pass this data to me. And what I want to do is, like I was doing before in the form, I want to keep track of some of this data. So I'm going to say, okay, well, let me keep these links in a piece of state because this is going to change over time. So I'm going to start with a use state that is an empty array. right? And so essentially, whenever I handle this new submission, I want to take that data and I want to set the links that are inside of this. We'll set the fave links here to be basically a new array that has the oh man. I basically want to pass this array. I want to add this to this array here. So I want to take this existing array of data and I want to add, right? So I want to be able to dot concat I'm so sorry, fam. I'm like, it's the midnight hour, I'm like, I'm bugging out. But let's say I want to take this array, and there's a couple of different ways to do it, right? We could do fave links and then dot. I think push is a good one that we can use, right? And well, no, push isn't gonna work because it returns the length. All right. Well, the thing is, what we want to do is we want to basically create a new array, right? So how I'll do this, I'll do it the old school way so I don't get confused. So let's just say let new man, all this at the same time. Last second. I'm gonna just write it the way I know how to write it. And then we'll add it later. We'll take a look at it later. All right, cool. So basically, I'm gonna create a new array, right? The new array is gonna contain whatever is inside of the old array, and then we're gonna pass the new piece of data into this array. So we're just creating a new array, but adding this to the end. This is a funky syntax that says, hey, spread all of the old data into this new array. So this is just a way to say, creating a new array with the values of the old array plus this thing at the end. That's gonna create a new, that's gonna update this fave links array for us with whatever this is being called to, right? So now I'm able to pass down to the table this fave links array as, oops, sorry about that. This fave links array as a piece of data, as props, of what we call it, right? So I'm rushing because we're running out of time, but essentially now the table will be able to receive this value of data called links. So inside of the table, what I'm able to do, given how React is structured, is if I'm going to pass data from one component to another, that component is going to receive what we call props. Props we got to pass in as a parameter to the component, but what it allows us to do is call that props object with the data that it was defined on. So props.links is going to be defined in props.links is going to refer to this prop here, right? And I can add as many different props as I want, but I call this one links and pass it this data. So when I call this one here, props.links is going to call that data that it's receiving from its parent component. Now that, if you just look at this, right, is going to do everything else that we were just doing the same. It's going to take the name, the URL from the data, create a table row, and do all this stuff, right, which is already fine. The only step I'm missing now is I need some way for our form to call this handle new submission function. So again, there's a couple ways to pass data to a component in JavaScript, in JS, in React, I'm sorry. One way is we pass like actual data like an array or something. But another thing is sometimes we're going to actually pass, we can pass functions down to a child component as well. And so this is exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to create a new prop, right? This is a prop, me saying, hey, anything where I'm passing a custom component, something that looks like an attribute, I'm really defining a prop. And so I'm going to pass this function in as a as data for that prop. So whenever this gets called, props dot on new submission, on new submit, right? It's actually going to call this handle new submission thing here. So when I go to my form, right? Again, I want my form to also receive props from its parent, because when we are ready to submit, I'm going to go ahead and say props dot, and then I think I copied it on new submit, and I'm going to pass into it the name and the URL from our forms, right? And I'm passing it as an object, because when it passes this all finally back into the parent, right? This function on new submit is essentially just going to call this handle new submission function that we created here with that data. That data is going to set the state. And when the state sets, right, once we set the state to be something different, this piece of data is able to be updated. So our table is going to receive some new data, which is thereby should allow for us to see our app fully working as we expected. Oh, my bad. So to call use state, we just got to make sure we import it from React. So import use state. Yeah. So that fixed that. So last quick test before we go. I'm sorry for going a little over, but appreciate y'all rocking with me. Woo, 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 woo. So cool. So now, as you can see, I'm able to actually update the table with the data from the form. We're passing the data as a prop, but the data now is able to be, remember, all of this first part is happening strictly in the form. But now I'm able to say, oh, cool, take this data, and when we submit it, add it to the table, right? And so now we're able to keep adding to the table. Again, we have that little bit of logic if this is not empty, if this is empty to not submit, right? So if I wanted to clean up the form real fast, so after we call props.onNewSubmit, submit, one thing that I could do is set the name to be the empty string again, and set the URL to be set the URL to also be an empty string. That way I kind of reset it every time somebody submits, right? So just one more test.com. When I submit, boom, but it didn't actually do what I wanted it to do. But y'all get the vibes, right? I'm sorry, I went a little over, so I'm gonna just stop for now. But we got to the main point of what we want to do, which is we're able to send data, we're able to process the data happening and send data from one component to another using React. There's a lot of really interesting things going on in how we do it. I'm gonna share the code with y'all so y'all can review it yourselves. But the point is, we're able to create components. Components are just functions comprised of JSX. Those components are able to work with data in two ways. We can either use what we call state to manage data that's changing within those components, like we did with the form, right? Handling the input changes and stuff like that. Or like we did here in this app.jsx, where we are keeping track of the array of data changing in this component, right? State allows us to keep track of data inside a component that's changing. The second thing we were able to do is send data from one component to another component. And the only way we can do that is by way of another method called props. Props allow us to, whenever we're rendering a component, to pass some data in to the component to use. But we can only do that clearly from whatever component is rendering those components, which is why we say the parent is what passes props into a child. So in this case, the reason that we couldn't pass props directly from the form file to the table is because we needed to be up a level so we could define what is the data that the table is going to receive. That's why the app component had to do that. The form, in order to make this all work, we needed to send data to the form to say, hey, whenever you've submitted some new thing, here's some a function you can call. And we defined that here in the parent and passed it to that component as props. With that being the case, the form then was able to The form was then able to call on new submit in order to thereby change that up, right? And that was how the form was then able to send the data to the app using props again, right? We use props to pass the data from form back by passing a callback function almost down. Then by changing the state whenever that happened, right, we were able to then change the value that the table received as input so that whenever the table called its props, right, it's getting the most updated version of that array. And I realized why this form wasn't working is because these inputs, we want these inputs to be tied to the state. So I'll just have to do this. And then this is one of the reasons why using state is helpful. Just to get that little feeling of okay, whenever I submit, it actually gets rid of whatever I previously typed. But yeah, fam, this is a pretty functional application. So I want you to take a look at the last two sessions as we walk through this so you can really dive into it a little bit deeper. We're going to talk a lot about it next time we link up. Again, I'm sorry I went a little over and rushed it at the end, but this is a functional React application with all of the core features of what we need to know about React. It has components, it has state, it has props. Those three things in a functional way is what we're going to be working the rest of the semester to understand, and building practical applications like this is the only way we'll get there in a way that'll make it make sense. So yeah, thank you so much for your time and your attention. Sorry we went a little over. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around. Otherwise,